along and sitting in front of your screens to participate this evening. And what I want to do, what I'm hoping to do, is give you a little glimpse of Orkney for people who haven't been there. I rather suspect that many people have been. But I'd also like to talk to you about some recent research that I've been doing. Now, in common with, I think, most research projects nowadays, this research is not mine alone. It is the work of many people, and we all talk on it, giving our own particular biases and interests at various times. But I've put onto the screen some of the main people who I collaborate with. And we do have various publications, which if you're interested in, I can point your secretary to or whatever in due course. Now, I think the archaeology of Orkney, it's something that's very well known. It's been written about. People like Gordon Childe included it in many of their iconic archaeological textbooks. So you can say that really around the world, the archaeology of Orkney is well known. And you might think that there's a limit to the amount of new research that could be done here. But in many ways, of course, in common with any archaeology, that isn't the case. And there is one particularly hidden side, which is what I want to bring out this evening. And that is the submerged landscape, the landscape that lies beneath the seas that surround Orkney. Now, the landscape of Orkney has changed dramatically since the end of the last ice age. And this is a change that is driven really by relative sea level change. Now, relative sea level change itself is a complex business, and that's a whole different lecture to kind of explain the ways in which sea and land move together in order to give us the changing sea levels that many people study and that we're beginning to see a little bit more today. My kind of thesis, what I've come to understand over the years since I graduated, which is an awful long time ago, is that if we're just looking at archaeological sites on land, the sites that I studied when I was a student and so on, we're missing a whole part of the picture because the face of the world has changed. And in order to understand the prehistoric communities of the past, we have to know what did the land look like? What sort of world did they live in? And of course, building in the submerged landscape is a big part of that. And in many ways, that's what we've been trying to do here in Orkney. Now, there's been an awareness of this underwater landscape for many, many years. The publication that's most commonly cited as drawing our attention to it is that of Clement Reid in 1913. He was a geologist. He worked in particular on British harbours and put together information that he was finding in order to speculate on the land that we would now call Doggerland. Reid didn't give it the name Doggerland, but as you can see from his map on the image, he recognised the central importance of the Doggerbank area. But we can push this study further back, and nicely for me, one of the things we like to kind of blow our own trumpets about, we can push it further back in Orkney. Trail Dennison, writing in 1893, in fact lecturing and writing, spoke of the fact that the evidence showed that the sea level had been much lower around Orkney. He was recognising the remains of submerged forests. And if you go back a little bit further, in 1847, you can see this hydrographic map, which inside the ring, I'm afraid you can't read it very clearly, but it does say submerged forest. And this is the forest of Otterswick, which is one of the big well-known Orkney submerged forest locations. But we can push it even further back. William Watt, who was a member of the family who were to go on and discover and research Skara Brae, he recognized in the Bay of Scale, down below where Skara Brae would be at the time in 1820, they didn't know that Skara Brae was there, but again, he recognized the remains of a submerged forest and speculated that this meant that the sea level must have been lower. So submerged sea levels, it's something that it's not particularly new to our understanding of the world. But what is new is that nowadays we've got the technology that allow us to study them. We've got a big advantage over these past antiquarians because really through related industries such as the oil industry, increased work on marine studies and things, we've got the equipment and the understanding to be able to look beneath the waves and start to build an understanding of that submerged, that hidden landscape. And we can supplement basic surveys with core sampling, and that to provide us with environmental detail. I'm going to give a bit more information on this in a bit, but just to give you some ideas of the sort of work that we're doing. And we can supplement it with other things, as you'll see in a minute. But there is now, what I wanted to just give you an idea is, the work that we're doing in Orkney, it's not particularly special in any way. This sort of work is going on all around the UK. So it's not just a question of kind of remote islands where we need to undertake this work. It's something that affects the whole way that we understand the early population of the British Isles. And there's a lot of really important, really interesting work going on. But up here in Orkney, we do have a sort of ideal location for a case study to carry out this research. There's lots of reasons. The waters around Orkney tend to be quite shallow. We've got some very high energy waters, but we've also got some very gentle areas, more protected areas. We've got fantastic archaeology. So if we've got great archaeology on land, what is it going to be like in the areas that are submerged? We know that we have sophisticated human human societies here, and we know that we have a history of rising sea levels. So there's a lot of things kind of behind our decision to work up here, and we've been working up here for 10, 12 years now. It's a slow process. It's obviously an expensive process. It's very weather dependent, so you can get a research grant and you can get all the team up here, and we might not get out of the house for the whole week. So it's kind of, it does have its frustrations, but it also has its rewards. Just to give you one or two of the buzzwords, sometimes you'll see this called transition zone prehistory. We're looking really, another word is white ribbon archaeology, looking at the area in shallow waters kind of between the big bathymetrical charts and land known terrestrial archaeology. You have a transition zone, if you like. And what we're trying to do is to build a seamless archaeology, to get that flow of information that runs from the landscape that we know down into the landscape that people in the past would have known. It's interdisciplinary work, multi-institutional. One of the things I really like about it is that it marries geoscience and all the kind of perhaps more fluffy, or whatever you want to call it, sciences that roll into archaeology. It uses oral histories. We can make use of all sorts of things in this. It's a great way of pulling together different strands of information and showing how they can work together, the ways in which they complement each other. Now, just to kind of run through some of it, well, it's relatively easy to examine the seabed and the immediate surface below that. Of course, one of the problems that we have is that the seabed isn't a proxy for the landscape of the past. It can be eroded, or it can have great deposits of sediment. So we need to get in underneath it. But the technologies are there to do all that. That's not difficult. One of the things that we have found difficult over the years is we can get lots of possible sites, we can get lots of dots on the map, but actually to verify them is much, much more difficult. And I think when we started the work, we were perhaps a little bit naive about this. It's very easy to kind of have the fixed image in your head of the great archaeology that we have on land here. But if you imagine some of our great sites, once they've been underwater for 5,000 years, they're not going to look like that. And so it's been much more slow process and a difficult process to actually verify some of the dots on our map. And what we're wanting to do, as I say, is to link our geoscience information with the existing archaeological record in order to produce an interpretation of life in the past of communities and things that is more complete, more realistic. We're never going to get to a total truth, but if we can get to more sort of holistic idea of the world and the way that things have gone, that's the sort of thing we're wanting to do. So you can see on the left here, we've got your kind of conventional terrestrial archaeological model taken with information from Canmore. And then you've got, for the same bay, this is a bay at the heart of Orkney, the Bay of Firth, you've got paleogeographic model showing how the sea has slowly flooded in and looking at areas of fresh water and changing intertidal zone and things like that. So the challenge that we really have in the work that we're doing, I mean, we're not short of terrestrial archaeological data. There's a big volume, in fact, just I think Oxbow have released it today, of the geophysics around the World Heritage Sites, which is really useful, cracking read and really useful landscape analysis. And there's a couple of chapters in that which we've contributed. But there's plenty of data about the sites on land. What we want to do is to combine the geoscience data from offshore with the archaeological data from on the land. And by doing this, our aim is really to kind of lift the landscape, lift the environment. It's often seen in archaeological publications as some kind of theatrical backdrop in front of which human activity plays out. But of course, both people and the world around them are constantly changing. And so what we're wanting to do is to look at this interaction. We're wanting to gather, to produce a more kind of dynamic interpretation, if you like. So in order to do this, we go about gathering the geoscience data. One of the problems we've had is that because we're often working in very shallow water, we can't use vessels that have a draft of more than a couple of meters. So we do a lot of our survey work from the little craft you can see in the picture. It's really like a jet ski, but it's a catamaran, so you can dangle all your survey data underneath it, but it doesn't draw very much draft, so we can take it into very shallow waters. We do a little bit of diving, much less than I think we thought when we started out, and we do coring and things on land and in the intertidal zone as well as underwater. So we can do our survey work, and then we start to do some core sampling informed by seismic information and so on. In order to build up an environmental picture, we can look at dates on the changing environmental conditions, and we can slowly start to build up a sea level curve. And just to give you an idea of the sites where we've been working so far and where we've been coring and doing our survey and taking data. Initially, we were particularly interested in Scapa flow, largely because of my interests in the Mesolithic and the very earliest settlement of Orkney. Over time, and as I'm going to talk today, we've slightly shifted that focus to look more at the World Heritage areas. I think it's one of the really interesting questions is the way that having a World Heritage designation biases research, and in this case trying to get publications accepted. We kept being asked, you know, this is all very interesting, but what's happening in the World Heritage site? So we shifted our focus slightly more over to the World Heritage areas. No less interesting, but it's a slightly artificial shift, if you like, purely because we've got World Heritage sites here, but it's produced some interesting material to think about. This is sort of basic data. We can come up with some images of changing sediments, sorts of things we're looking at. Here you've got the Lochs of Stenness and Harry in the Google image, which of course have the great sites of the Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stenness, Ness of Brodgar, and so on the isthmus between them. And the first thing, therefore, that we really wanted to achieve was to start building a basic sea level curve, to look at the way in which relative sea level around Orkney has changed. And right back when we first were getting our data together, this produced some surprises. I think we were all prepared for the idea that the submerged landscape had impacted on Mesolithic Orkney. What perhaps we weren't quite so prepared for was the possibility that the submerged landscape had also impacted on the early Neolithic and possibly had a legacy even into the later Neolithic. So then we had to start thinking about, well, if sea only reaches its present level around 4,000 years ago, around about 2000 BC, well, you know, that means that we're not just looking for hunter-gatherer sites underwater, but we could potentially be looking for Neolithic sites. And that kind of changed the whole ball game. But it also meant that all the work that was being done on those Neolithic sites and work that's being done looking at things like the way in which complex sort of sophistication, if you like, of communities, it's a very laden word, but of architecture, of material goods and so on here in Orkney, the way in which that changed over time, it had to be seen against a backdrop of a changing landscape of rising sea levels. And we really felt that changed in many ways that the whole ball game. So as we were working on this, we sort of came to the realization that the impact that you've got these great sites, you've got these stone circles and settlement sites like Skara, and in fact there are many, many other amazing Neolithic settlement sites scattered across Orkney, that if we're really going to understand them, we've got to understand this relationship between land and water. And if you then zoom in on the heart of the World Heritage area, on this isthmus between the Lochs of Stenness and Brodgar and the location of the Ring of Brodgar, the standing stones of Stenness and so on, that in fact this is an area where you've got very, very dynamic changes in water level going on. And that in order to understand, I mean, why would people even build these monuments in an area where the water is rising all around them? That we had to get a handle on this and have a look at this in a bit more detail. So we started out by doing sonar scans of the Loch of Stenness. What I should say very quickly here is that I am mainly talking about, and you'll see all the models are of the Loch of Stenness. We also tried to work in the Loch of Harry on the other side of the monuments. But in fact, because of the nature of the loch, it's got a lot of organic material, a very soft, uneven bottom. It wasn't possible to do the sort of work that we were able to do in the Loch of Stenness. And so we don't have the data from the Loch of Harry at the moment to match that in the Loch of Stenness. That's something that we're still working on. So we could start doing sonar surveys and other surveys, building up a bathymetrical image of the loch, the depths of the loch. Then we could do seismic survey to look under the present seabed, see where there were rock outcrops, see where there were pockets of sediment and so on. And then we could move on, you can see the green dots, to take core samples and look at the sediments themselves. And we could start to build up these images of the loch, where you can see a couple of our seismic lines, lines that we found of particular interest, some core locations, and the basic bathymetry of the loch. And here's the sort of thing that we began to find and that we began to be interested in. This is immediately to the west of the Ness of Brodgar, on the other shore of the loch, on the far shore of the loch, and just inland from the shore. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but you can see the white line that demarcates the difference between land today and then the underwater landscape. And just in the shallows there's a long mound, a very unusual long mound that stands up proud from the seabed. We have done a little bit of diving on it. And in fact, it's one of the places where the divers have said these stones definitely don't look as if they're just naturally collapsed or as if it's an outcrop of bedrock. This is a pile of stones. But of course, a pile of stones underwater is just a pile of stones underwater. It's very, very difficult to get to the stage where you can prove that it's something else. But this is one of the sites that we've been looking at. And here you can see the seismic sections, particularly the shorter one at the bottom, showing up the mound, which is labelled as Unit 1. And then you can see the way in which, in fact, sediments are banked up against it. Really, I'm just putting these images up to kind of give you some familiarity with the sort of things that we're looking at. I think you can understand that this is very specialist work. I mean, you do whole master's degrees just learning how to interpret it. I'm very much the archaeologist in this. The sort of wisdom that I can pass on is what I've gleaned from working with my colleagues. But these are the sort of images that we would hope to get and then be able to analyse. And we can look at different lithologies, all of which again help us to look at things like sedimentation, at whether the loch has been a freshwater loch or a marine loch, things like that. And here, looking at the microfauna within those sediments. And then if we've got a whole series of boreholes across the loch, we need to start to join those together in order to build up a coherent history for the life of the loch. And so this is the sort of thing that we would then be trying to do, to look at different sediments and tie them together between the different boreholes. Well, that's all very well, but what does it all mean? Well, here you've got, this is a sort of supposedly a photograph of the mists of time, just to show you that we're kind of moving from, if you like, the data acquisition into trying to understand and interpret that data, which is a different matter altogether. And this is actually published, this diagram, but it just, what we wanted to do was produce a kind of summative illustration of the history of the loch. And so working from A to F, you're going from sort of early period when human activity in Orkney is, we've got a little bit of evidence of people being around, but just sort of hunter-gatherer exploratory activity, if you like. At that point in time, the level of water in the loch is much higher, but it's a freshwater loch, and the sea is in fact several kilometres distant. Over time, you see the water levels in the loch decrease. We think this is probably due to an erosive event. Handily for us, there's only one exit for water out of the loch. So that kind of helps us to study some of these things. And then you get the water level dropping, still a freshwater loch. Over time, gradually, water level rising again. And as sea level outside, around the Orkney archipelago rises, the brackish waters flood into the loch changes to become a marine loch, and eventually will settle at its present levels. The other thing to notice in this diagram is just the changes in sedimentation, in rate of sediment, that in relatively recent millennia, in fact, sort of early Neolithic, you get a great increase in sedimentation rate in the loch, and that is something that's also of interest. And so here you get the model of one of the most up-to-date models. This is about 6 months old, but where we're trying to look at what was the land like that they were building these stone circles? What was the land like when Nessa Brogga was a sort of active, flourishing site? And you can see that, in fact, the loch itself is much, much smaller. It's at the time, at the initial period, sort of freshwater to brackish loch. You've got a large expanse of reed marsh running up towards the sites. And then you've got a rock lip with boulders. And we think that this rock lip probably provided a source of raw material. We have done, again, a little bit of diving along it. There's a bit more work to be done. But of course, then as the water levels rise, so the people who are strutting their stuff along the isthmus, they lose access to this source of building stone. But, and then you've got the land as we know it today. So it is a very different landscape. And here, just kind of summing it up in words, if you like, you've got the freshwater lake with high levels of water, water level dropping, and gradually the sea flooding in, it becomes a brackish and then marine lake. And of course, this will have a great impact on all sorts of things: vegetation, access to fresh water, all sorts of things going on. And interestingly, that change takes place at some stage between the early Neolithic and the sort of establishment of the late Neolithic here in Orkney. So we're imagining for Neolithic Orkney very much a changing world. I think that's one of the big things that's come out of this study for me, that for us change is very threatening, very difficult, because we've lived in a period where the world in which we live has been relatively stable, certainly for many centuries. That wasn't the case for our Orcadian ancestors. They lived in a landscape that was constantly changing. For them, change was just the norm. It's what the world did. But of course, that has an impact on them. And that's when things start to get interesting for me. So we're talking about what's the impact of rising water levels? Well, obviously, loss of land, loss of building stone, perhaps other resources, fresh water access will change, foodstuffs. If you're a farmer, what's the impact on your fields, even from, say, wind blow, bringing in increasingly salt deposits onto those fields? What about the arrival of seals, of seawater, marine fish and things? These things don't happen overnight. They'll have happened very slowly. But if you think about a community with a memory to how things were in the past, you have to start thinking about how do they accommodate all of this into their worldview. Now here, if interpretations are difficult, some of the basic interpretations to prove, we're moving even further into the realm of speculation. But I like to think that as an archaeologist, that's our job. Our job is to tell stories. We're the kind of, in some ways, the storytellers, the guardians of the past for today. And we're not throwing up stories as absolute truths. We're throwing up stories to help us understand things. And those stories will constantly change. People might have better stories, different stories, other stories. So what I just want to do now is to just run through some of the ways in which this makes sense for me, the way in which my kind of personal thinking is going. I'd probably give you a totally different lecture next year or in 2 years' time or whatever, but that's the joy of archaeology. It keeps us on our toes. So there's evidence, not just from Orkney, from wider, much further research across much of certainly our little corner of northwestern Europe, for example, that you have a change in significance between the marine world and the terrestrial world, between the way in which people view them with the rise in farming, with the establishment of farming. And some people have called this the slighting of the sea. And you can read papers where people will discuss how isotope analysis shows that Mesolithic communities tend to eat a lot of marine resources and Neolithic communities tend to eat a lot of terrestrial resources. And of course, initially, because we're pulling together different strands of information, we tend to see this as very one-sided. We tend to focus on one simple resource. But what if it's more than just a bit of a preference for meat? I think for a long time we just thought, oh well, they've suddenly got access to cattle, so burgers become really tasty and interesting for them, and nobody wants fish suppers anymore. Everybody's moving over to McDonald's, other burgers being available. But what if it's a bit more than that? What if it's some sort of taboo? Or even a veneration? What's the difference between a taboo and a veneration? One of the things that interests me is how would we distinguish between them archaeologically? And I think that's something for us to come back to. But just thinking about the world of the farmer, the one thing the farmer needs is land, but they also need favourable conditions in which to grow their crops and for their animals to live. And if they don't have that, their very existence is threatened. And one thing about farming communities, they're much less flexible, they're much less resilient than the hunter-gatherer communities. Hunter-gatherer communities can split up, they can move to different areas. Generally, they're living at much smaller levels of population. There's less pressure on the land. Once you become a farmer, you're very much, if you're upon the pun, putting your eggs in one basket. And if you don't have a good harvest, if you've got a big community, it's not going to be that easy to see them through the winter. So the one thing the farmers need is to believe that they have control over the world around them. In some ways, as humans, our whole lives are built on hope. They're built on the hope that we'll be able to harvest enough grain and we'll have enough meat to see us through the winter. And of course, what's happening here in Orkney is that not only is the land under threat because sea level is rising, but there's no kind of control over that. And so the farmers are finding it much more difficult to kind of perhaps believe in the future, to believe that life can continue. They're not stupid. They know that the sea levels are rising. And all of this is happening as the farming communities are becoming established here. Now, Orkney is a great place. It's very fertile. Populations can grow. Generally, you can do a lot of what you want. But how do you make sense of the encroachment of the sea into your landscape? It's very odd to me that they build these great monuments in the one part of Orkney where that encroachment is the most visible, where the land is the most vulnerable. We know that over the history of the site at Ness of Brodgar, the spit of land on which it stands, it got smaller by at least 50%. The area of land that people had to work on, to live on, whatever they were doing at Ness of Brodgar, it got smaller. They lost a lot of territory. So how do you make sense of that? Well, of course, one of the ways that you can make sense of it is through telling stories, is through oral histories that pass on your wisdom about the world and help the next generation to understand it. Now, of course, we don't have those stories for the Neolithic. That's a great tragedy. But actually, the interesting thing is that there are parts of Orkney where we do have traditional stories and we do have traditional poems which talk about a landscape that is not the landscape of today. Now, for many years, people have thought that some of these poems, for example, that talk about grazing horses on areas that are now just skerries, or playing football on a sandbank that's underwater, not even somewhere that's occasionally above water like the Dogger Bank, but somewhere that's well underwater. People thought that these were just kind of fairy tales, that they were something, you know, that had been cooked up. But in fact, if you start to look at them in more detail and to look at the different pattern that they're building up, they are talking about a landscape with a lower sea level. Whether that relates to an actual landscape with a lower sea level, we can't be sure. But it's an interesting thing to think about in the context of the Orkney Archipelago and what's been going on around the Neolithic. But oral histories aren't the only thing that you're going to use to make sense of this world around you. You also have an element of physical adaptation. I mean, of course, the obvious thing to do if you're living by the sea and as sea level rises, if it starts to threaten your landscape, is to move away from it. And in fact, at sites like Skara Brae, we see that in the very latest years of the settlement, they stop growing crops. And one of the theories of the recent research is that the increased salt spray and sand blow onto the fields as the sea level encroached on the site made crop growing really untenable. And then as you move more into the Bronze Age, in fact, of course, your big Neolithic coastal settlement sites are abandoned. And indeed, it's worth noting that many of the settlement sites that we know today, like the site at Skara Brae, Linxon Outland, Poole in Sandy, and so on, they've all survived where they've been protected by some sort of offshore barrier. And that's another sort of interesting thing to think about. Did it allow people to live a little bit longer? Has it preserved the archaeology? What's going on in the main body of the landscape, if you like? But it's not just a question of moving away from the coast. Another thing, of course, you can do is to build great monuments. It's something that societies often do when they're under stress. And of course, at this time, we see the development and elaboration of the burial monuments, tombs, as we've often called them in the past. And it's not just about using them for burial, but there's a certain amount of emotional adaptation going on. I think we can see that these sites, they're designed to be entered and re-entered. There's a lot of very elaborate things going on to do with the defleshing of bones, moving skeletal parts around and things like that. It's a whole complex world of activity, of thought processes, of reasoning, and it's all enmeshed. And it's very difficult for us to untangle any single element of it. But of course, another thing about it is that archaeology, when it comes down to it, archaeology is about people. And the one thing we know about people, I mean, I think we're seeing that at the moment, is that people don't always follow the patterns that we think they should. And as archaeologists, we rely on patterns for our interpretations, but people are unpredictable, superstitious, do things just on a whim, all sorts of reasons that it's very difficult for us as archaeologists to actually predict what might have happened in the past. All we can start to do is look at possibilities to kind of broaden our interpretations, if you like. And we do get to this business about, well, you know, yeah, perhaps there's some sort of taboo as sea levels are rising, maybe. I mean, people are clearly still making marine journeys, but, you know, the whole attitude to the sea has changed. Have we got some sort of taboo going on? And then you do get into very difficult territory. How do you evidence a taboo? What's the difference between taboo and veneration and these sort of things? There are just odd little hints. And one of them, in fact, has been noticed and written about for a while. But nobody really, because we hadn't got the picture, nobody's really kind of thought about it in the widest sense. But in fact, when Renfrew worked at Maeshowe, he his drawings, and for many people, they've noticed that Maeshowe sits on a platform. And the same thing happens at Barnhouse, the great ritual, ceremonial, whatever you want to call it, structure at Barnhouse also sits on a platform. And the interesting thing about those platforms is that they're made of sediment, largely of mud, that has been dredged up from the floor of the neighbouring loch, of the Loch of Harry. And when the Colin Richards and co, when he edited up his volume, writing up his work at Maeshowe, they commented on the fact that it was slightly odd that people would have gone to all this trouble to go down to the edge of the loch and bring up lacustrine sediments in order to construct the platforms on which they were going to build these great monuments. Now, we can't take it any further than that. Other sources of sediment were available, but people didn't choose to use them. Sadly, for the argument, at the Stones of Stenness, the platform isn't made of lochside sediment. So again, you know, whatever the patterns are not clear. They're not necessarily there. But there are these little hints that just show us how the geoscience can play into a more nuanced view of what's going on. And of course, there are other things happening as well. And I think we have to be aware of seeing things in little individual pigeonholes. We have to start thinking of the way in which everything plays together. You're getting this elaboration of architecture, not just of monuments, but also of house styles. You're getting considerable elaboration of material culture, the pottery, grooved ware, but a whole load of other things as well. Farming is, if you like, well-established, highly successful, population levels, some of the dates as data material, using radiocarbon dates as proxies and things. Population levels seem to be rising. Social elaboration, all these things going on. Now, you can argue that this is, you know, just all part of the complexity of life in Neolithic Orkney. But what I'm trying to sort of hopefully give you the idea is that that complexity, in order to really, not even to understand it, but to illustrate it, you're having to draw on a range of material. And that if you only take the picture from the land, you're going to be missing an awful lot. And so you get these nice reconstructions here, like image of the site at Nesselbrugge, and you can see how great swathes of reed marsh. I mean, we're trying to give the impression of a landscape that is very different to the landscape that we know today. And really, that's where I'd like to leave it and just invite questions mediated through Rob, if you can put in chats and things. But I hope I've given you some food for thought and some things to think about over the coming weeks. Thank you very much.
Carolyn, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I mean, you've sort of managed to cover almost the entire spectrum, from the geoscience through to the landscape, through to how are people responding to that as well, and what the sort of impacts would be. I'm going to ask people, if you've got questions, please do pop them in the chat, and then I will relay them on. I have a few myself, just to get things warmed up, as it were. So, Carolyn, I was wondering, you talked about some fairly large areas of land being lost to the sea, so all around the seashore, and particularly around the Ness of by 50% and so on. Presumably also as trees are being cut down and lost to the islands as well, you're getting increased salt spray coming on, which is presumably affecting fertility. In those sort of circumstances, I would have expected to see things like an increase in violence turning up between people as they're starting to compete for resources, and also efforts to try and ameliorate that sort of violence and competition as well. Can you tell us, do you see those sorts of things in Orkney, in the skeletal remains, or in the sort of the social practices that you see on the islands?
Violence is certainly present. Whether or not you can say there is an increase, I'm not sure. Rick Schulting did a really interesting study looking for evidence of violence in the skeletal material from the tombs, and found plentiful examples of it. He was, because of obviously we have an awful lot of skeletal material, he was focusing on skulls and upper limbs, I think, in order to identify violence, because those were felt to be the sort of vulnerable areas that would be most likely to have a damage that would show up in the bone structure. In other words, bashing and cutting and things. And he did get, plentiful evidence. He said that it could be construed as domestic type violence, but equally it could be community, more of an inter-community violence. Of course, there are issues with a study like that, because we're not totally sure what the qualifications were to have your body put into a tomb, apart from presumably being dead. We know that we don't have enough skeletons from the tombs, and it does seem that quite a large proportion of the community is buried elsewhere. We've got one or two other burials, but not very many. So, you know, there could be some biasing factor going. At one point, there was a suggestion from Dave Lawrence, in fact, that many of the bodies seem to have come to sort of had nasty illnesses and things, that maybe one of the qualities that you needed in order to be put into a tomb was that you had to have died a horrible death or something. I think that's now slightly been drawn back. And Rebecca Crozier at Aberdeen is also looking at this. So there is work going on, but the problem is identifying the violence in the community. But you're right, things like trees, I mean, very much also now with Michelle Farrell at Coventry and Jane Bunting at Hull, Scott Timpany at UHI on a much wider project, bringing in, looking at things like sedimentation, changes in vegetation, because the increase in sedimentation does seem to be partly due to increased runoff, perhaps with opening up of the landscape for farming. The trees, actually, the change starts to show up in the pollen record before we see a really established Neolithic signal. But of course, you know, archaeology is always looking for its signals to be sort of, you know, consanguineous, but sometimes it can be difficult because the sort of quality of different data sets don't always match in the same sort of way.
Apropos of exactly that point, Carolyn, I think this one flows very nicely. A question from Charles White here. Do you think the increased sedimentation you mentioned was due to the impact of farming?
We think that that is certainly a significant contribution. I think we would be reluctant to say entirely due to. I mean, you do have other things going on. There's elements of environmental change, increased storminess as you move into the Bronze Age. But yeah, one of the things we would hypothesize is that the clearing of the farms has an impact. Having said that, I mean, the farmers, again, they're not totally stupid. They must have worked out if the soil is if you've got cultivation, if you've got movement and sediment and things, and no doubt to deal with it. One problem that we've got is that actually around the shores of the loch, which are very intensively farmed today, we don't have the sort of well-preserved farming sites where we might farming, or what I should say is they haven't been recognised to date. But from that point of view, I would refer you to Oxbow volume, I think it's called Landscapes Revealed, where Mark Edmonds and others the landscape around the World Heritage Sites and the sort of the if you like, archaeological sites that occur in that landscape that have come up through geophysics survey.
Okay, folks, any further questions for Caroline? Otherwise, I'm going to jump in again just to give you all a moment or two. I'm fascinated, Caroline, about the pollen sampling you've done in the lochs, and I presume also around the sort of quieter areas of the sea as well.
Yeah.
Are there sort of technical differences between the sort of preservation you get in seawater to what you get in a waterlogged sample, sort of from a terrestrial sample? And also, are you actually seeing sort of evidence in those marine samples for farming and for other forms of human activity?
Well, of course, the sediments from the seabed were laid down in fresh water, not in salt water. When we're coring down to depths, you know, our aim is to get down and to be looking at the landscape when it was dry land. And so very much what we're doing is looking for pockets where we might, for example, be on the edge of a freshwater lochen or something like that. So that although the upper levels of some of our sediment cores would be laid down in marine conditions, the lower levels are all in freshwater conditions. And I'm afraid, not being a pollen specialist, and sort of having eyeballed pollen grains only many, many years ago, I can't give you the kind of technical details, but we are beginning to do a lot more work and looking at, it's not just about the preservation, but modelling the way in which, I don't know if you know the work that Michelle Farrell and Jane Bunting are doing, but looking at how you can model from your individual core site out to a landscape. And that is something that we've very much been doing. And in fact, bringing in all sorts of other things. I haven't seen the results yet, but we've had some samples out for ancient DNA analysis and things. Really interested, perhaps mainly in animals, but also if that can shed light on vegetation and things.
Karen, I've got a question here from Vicky, and excuse me if this is something you've touched on as I may have missed, but is there evidence for Mesolithic or Neolithic people consuming seabirds or their eggs or making any use of them at all?
Yeah, good question. Scarabray, hopefully the report might one day be out. I don't know if people are aware, but there were big excavations at Scarabray in the 70s. A lot of eggshell in the middens there from birds. I'm not sure at the moment where it stands, but I do know when they worked on it in the sort of 80s, you couldn't get from a flattened piece of eggshell to the bird itself. And I don't know about preservation of DNA and things in the eggshells. I'm not sure whether that's been solved. But there is also at Skara Brae in particular, and any of these big Neolithic sites in Orkney, extensive collection of worked bird bone, particularly used for jewellery, because bird bone's very light and it's often perforated down the middle with a natural hole, so it lends itself to bead making and things. So extensive use of these resources. And yeah, you're right, the implication moving on from that is the farmers at Skara Brae are not just farming, they are using the resources of the coast. They're certainly hunting seabirds, and there is also fish bone from many of the sites. So it's a question of, you know, looking at the relative abundance and things. Going back into the Mesolithic, we don't have any Mesolithic sites in Orkney with good organic preservation. But if you look at other Mesolithic sites in Scotland and then moving out around Europe, yes, extensive use of seabirds, fish, marine resources, both eggs and meat and feathers, all sorts of different things. You get specific types of arrows for hunting birds so that you don't damage the plumage, so that you can use the plumage and things like that.
Okay. A question that came in literally the moments that I asked that question, one from Alex, asking, is there any evidence for consumption of freshwater fish? So it follows on, I suppose, directly from what you were just saying about exploitation of natural resources.
Freshwater fish, I can't answer. I'm not sure about. Skara Brae, as I say, hopefully the detailed report. Another site with plentiful fish bone is Links of Notland, up on Westray. Again, there is some material published. Fraser Sturt published many years ago now a very useful paper. He was mainly looking at the marine fish from the Nap of Hower. Freshwater fish, I mean, in Orkney today, it's big for fishing, but in fact the trout fisheries in Orkney brought in mults and so on, brought in fish. So I can't tell you about the freshwater fish consumption. Very sorry about that.
Okay. One last question from Gerda, something completely different. This one, is there any evidence that the population itself changed with the change in the environment? For instance, is it visible in the DNA?
There has been, or is at the moment, increasing amounts of DNA work being done in Orkney. I don't know the answer to your question. And I don't know whether people are looking at that. I mean, people look very much at sort of Mesolithic, Neolithic transition and evidence of population change, and they've looked at the sort of moving it into the Bronze Age and things. I don't know whether people have looked very much at, for example, the change from the early Neolithic to the late Neolithic. I mean, you certainly get quite a lot of changes in material culture, both big material culture buildings and artifacts and things. I haven't seen anything that has suggested change, but there are some oddities, like, for example, the Orkney vole, which arrives sort of sometime later in the Neolithic, I think, or towards the end of the early Neolithic, and is, you know, seems to be coming in from northern France area. Now, whether that's coming in with new people, I mean, my personal theory is that the Orkney voles were put into pots and taken on long sea journeys to provide you with food for the duration of the sea journey, because they breed, they're pretty tame, they thrive in a sort of enclosed environment and things. But, you know, absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. It's just kind of trying to make sense of why you would get voles here in Orkney, where their closest relatives are in northern France, and there just are none whatsoever And I think there's a recent paper suggesting that red deer, there might be some imported red deer as well. Not sure I fancy the journey with a red deer in the boat. An Orkney vole I could cope with. But so I'm sorry, Gerda. Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I haven't seen anything published on that.
Carolyn, thank you very much. I think that's brought all of our questions to an end there, and the timing is just perfect as well. So on behalf of everyone here who's got their cameras turned off and they're all on mute, I would like to thank you very much for that simply fascinating talk. It is marvelous to see simply the whole breadth of evidence that's being brought together on a total landscape as well, and to see so many different strands of evidence being brought together. It's going to be absolutely extraordinary to see what comes out of it in the end. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much indeed, Carolyn, from here in the Southlands to you in the North. And for everyone else here, please remember we will have another meeting next month. Details will be coming out to you in your inboxes shortly. But from us here in Cambridge, thank you very much to you there, Caroline, in the North, and to everyone that's joined us this evening from around the country.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.